Hello Year 11 Ancient and Modern History students, and welcome to the short screencast on historical bias. Now, I'd like to start with a quote. History is written by the victors. Now, this is a very famous quote as stated by Winston Churchill. Okay, now what he means by this simply is that whoever comes out on top in a particular period of history, they are the ones who are going to be remembered favourably by history. Okay, now two examples of this. Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, he is remembered as a victor. Now, one of the reasons he is remembered as a victor is because when he came to power, he had a whole team of people who were writing down great deeds, all the great deeds that he did. They were writing down all of his legendary things. He also wrote his very own history to be put on the wall of his tomb. Okay, so this is a man who did literally write his own history. Now, he is remembered as being a great man, but what everybody kind of forgets is that when he came to power, he killed a lot of his political enemies. He killed thousands of people in battle, or well, his armies did. And he did some very nasty things in his rise to power. People choose to forget that, and they remember him as being a great man. Now, this man, on the other hand, Adolf Hitler, you've been raised your entire life to believe that this man is pure evil. So he is not a victor, okay? And he's literally not a victor because Germany lost World War II. But I just want to give you a point here, that if you were a German in 1933 when Hitler came to power, this man was a legend. Okay, he came to power on a wave of charisma and popularity. He fixed Germany's economic problems. He turned them once again into a European superpower after the travesty that was World War I. Okay, so this is a man who, before World War II, he was doing great things for Germany. But a lot of history chooses to forget that because of what he did during World War I and killing millions upon millions of innocent people. Okay, now he did not write his own history because he committed suicide when he lost the war. So history remembered him in a way that was written by other people about him. And they focus on all of the horrible things that he did, with good reason. Okay, so that's just two examples. Now, a couple more quotes to get you thinking about this concept. Another one from Winston Churchill. Look at that guy. Top hat, cigar, Tommy gun, gangster suit. It does not get more badass than that, people. Now, he stated that history will be kind to me, for I intend to write it. Pretty simple statement. And he did indeed write his own history. Now, this man over here, no, it's not Colonel Sanders, nor is it Albert Einstein. It is, in fact, Mark Twain. Now, he writes that the very ink with which history is written is merely fluid prejudice. Now, that is a brilliant, a beautiful statement. He's basically saying that no matter what history is written down at whatever point in time, we are putting our prejudices onto paper when we write that history. And that is so true of his period of time, when basically, the world was being colonised by white men. White men were the epitome of all things good, and they wrote about, black African people as basically slaves, okay? Now remember, a lot of people say that how can history be biased? It's all just fact. On this date, this happened. Now that's true. There are a lot of facts in history, but not all history is fact. A good deal of history is known as historical interpretation, where we need to interpret events based on who wrote them, why they wrote them, okay, things like that. Now, a good example is the little picture in the right-hand corner, the concept of media bias. When George Bush was in power, he was a Republican president. The Republican Party basically controls the media in America, so he was never, ever, ever, insulted on television. However, Barack Obama, on the other hand, he's a Democrat. Democrats have very little power when it comes to media. So if you look at, popular media in America about Barack Obama, it's overwhelmingly negative, okay? So that is bias of the facts. Now, here's some quick examples of a historical fact versus historical interpretation. Now, it's a fact that the Russian Revolution took place in 1917. That's indisputable. But an interpretation of that fact is that it took place because of a massive famine. And that's true as well. There was a massive famine, but that's only one interpretation of the event. Other historians might look at other interpretations of that fact. Now, Adolf Hitler was elected as Reich Chancellor in 1933. Indisputable fact, that happened, okay? But the interpretation is that he was elected as Chancellor due to his charismatic leadership and his promises to fix Germany's economic woes. And that's not a fact, that's just an interpretation. Okay, so yes, it's true. He was elected partly because of his charisma, but that's not all of the facts. That's just one interpretation. Now, an ancient history one. Approximately 300 Spartan soldiers, along with other Greek troops, fought at the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BC. And you can see Leonidas with his incredibly ripped abs right there. Now, that's true. But the interpretation is that they fought off a Persian force of over 1 million soldiers for 3 days. Now, the historical interpretation that there were 1 million Persian troops has been pretty much discredited these days. Okay, but that was the first number that was given by the ancient Greek historian Herodotus. And it's pretty much accepted as being not true these days. So that is an interpretation that has been proven wrong. Okay? Now, there's many reasons why people might display bias when they write something down. Now, the first one is where they're born. Okay, so if you're born in Athens, you pretty much hate Sparta. If you're born in Queensland, you support Queensland during the state of origin, so on and so forth. Now, politics as well. So I will be, very honest and say that I have a bias towards Labour when it comes to politics. Now, also gender. Okay, particularly if you are a male. Ancient history is very, very much male-dominated. So is early modern history. You very rarely hear voices from women. Now, also your religion, that particularly becomes evident in things like the Crusades. Okay, also your age. Okay, so, are you going to display a bias towards older or younger people? Your education. Are you well educated? What school were you educated in? Were you educated in a particular country based on a particular syllabus? Things like that. Okay, your time of birth. So what ancient historical period you were born into. Okay, so if you were born into the Roman Republic, you would think the Roman Republic was the best form of government ever. However, if you were born into the Roman Empire a few hundred years later, you would show bias towards that. Now also your occupation, so what you do for a job, your culture, how you've been raised, how much money you have, okay, and that's a really, really big one. And also your social standing. Do you have, power in politics? Do you have friends in high places? Things like that. Okay, so all of these things can contribute to the bias in a document. Now, you need to be able to spot this bias in historical sources, so you need to look at how bias is displayed. Now, bias is generally displayed through language use, and you'll be doing this in English as well, so it's actually pretty obvious a lot of the time. So in many sources, it's really evident what perspective the author is presenting, okay? So it can be really easy to spot this bias, particularly in ancient historical sources. Now, a perspective are the opinions, thoughts, and feelings held by a particular person about a particular topic. So it is literally the way that they see or feel about an issue. Okay, so my perspective on reality TV is that you actually get stupider when you watch it. I hate it. Okay, but there are millions of people the world over who love reality TV. So we have a different perspective based on who we are. Okay, now I use this little comic in the right-hand corner because this is what's known as perspective shifting. And it's a good example of how you can use perspective. Okay, so it's obviously a cartoon about the fairy tale of the Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Now, in the original, Goldilocks sneaks into a house, she sleeps in their bed, she eats their food. It is the ultimate invasion of privacy. And she's portrayed as being pretty nasty for doing that. Now, in this one, they have shifted the perspective to suit a modern audience. So instead of eating their food, sleeping in their bed, she's been trawling through their personal information online. Okay, so basically they've shifted it, the perspective, for a modern internet, social networking audience. Now, the things that you will be looking for, particularly in ancient historical sources when it comes to bias. Firstly, only the wealthy could read and write. Okay, so you do not hear any voices from people who aren't wealthy and aren't educated. So you never hear from the poor section of society. Secondly, you'll very rarely hear from any women. Okay, and when you do see something that is written by a woman, take note of it, because it's very rare for that to happen. Thirdly, cities and countries were constantly fighting with each other. So there will be, if you live in Athens and you're at war with Sparta, anything that's written at that time is going to have a massive bias towards Sparta because you're at war with them and you hate them, okay? Now, the backstabbing nature of politics is another really big one, particularly Roman politics. If you were a Roman politician, one of the best ways to stay in power was to simply slander off all of your political enemies. Basically insult them constantly, and that used to be normal, okay? Now also, your religion, particularly when you get to things like the later Roman Empire and Christianity comes into play. Okay, so Christianity becomes very important in later Roman Empire, okay, because basically they show bias towards a whole heap of different Roman traits, particularly things like the arena, okay? And then finally, propaganda. Okay, so a lot of ancient historical sources are actually made as being propaganda to sell a particular side of the story. Okay, so they're actually deliberately written or drawn or performed so that they make someone look good. Okay, Now, this is an example of visual bias. This is Egyptian propaganda. So this shows Ramses II, one of the greatest Egyptian pharaohs, smiting his enemies. Now look at Ramses. He's tall, he's big, he's buff. They're really portraying him as being this great warrior king. Okay, he's also wearing the warrior crown. Okay, now he's got these Nubian enemies in front of him. He's grasped 3 of them by the hair. It looks like they're begging for their lives. They're small, they're skinny. Okay, this is showing Ramses II as being brilliant, as being fantastic. It is propaganda. It's not true. He wouldn't have been that big. They wouldn't have been that small. But it gets across the point that he defeated his enemies. So that is visual bias. Now this one here, Trajan's column in Italy, all up, you can't really see it that well, but all in the spirals going up that column are all of Trajan's greatest victories, military victories, political victories, religious victories. It's basically everything good that he's done in his life. So this column is a giant phallic symbol which basically says Trajan is awesome. Do you think he was maybe compensating for something? Okay, so that's another example of visual bias. Now, I really want to get across the point. The bias is inherent. Okay, so some people say that everything is biased. Now, I don't really believe that. Everything will have some kind of bias, but a lot of the time it's very difficult to spot, okay, because modern historians particularly try to be neutral when they write something. But in some way, shape or form, pretty much everyone has a form of bias. It's the product of years of social and cultural conditioning. We're all biased. And many early and later historians were as well, and they really, really let it show in what they write. Now, I use the example of Ned Kelly here because this is an inherent Australian bias. A lot of people in Australia see this guy as being a folk hero, when in actual fact, he was a criminal who shot police officers. Now, just think of if Ned Kelly existed in this day and age. A criminal going around, robbing banks, shooting police officers. Would we see him as a hero now? No, we wouldn't. So why did we then? Okay, perspective and bias. Now, one of the biggest, most important skills in ancient and modern history is known as critical analysis. So when you critically analyse a range of different sources, you're basically looking at why it was written, who it was written by, and what purpose does it serve, okay? And that is such an important skill. Now, we'll be doing lots of practice on this throughout class. This is just a brief introduction to the concept of historical bias in sources. Hope you've enjoyed it. See you all in class.